For the first time in American television history, the audience didn't just watch a mafia boss, they rooted for him. In The Sopranos, Tony Soprano is violent, manipulative, and responsible for countless crimes, yet millions of viewers welcomed him into their living rooms every week. He worries about his kids, he struggles with anxiety, he sits in therapy and talks about fear, guilt, and control. The show teaches us to see him not as a criminal, but as a man under pressure. And once you understand a man, it becomes easier to forgive him. That emotional access is the illusion, because the mafia does not survive on self-reflection. It survives on silence, fear, and disappearance. Real mob bosses do not explain themselves. They do not confess weakness, and they certainly do not invite anyone inside their head. The moment they do, they become vulnerable, and vulnerability is fatal. This is where fiction and reality violently separate. Tony Soprano feels authentic because he is written to be relatable. His anger has context, his cruelty has excuses, his violence is framed as necessity rather than choice. Television turns organized crime into a psychological drama, where power is negotiated through emotion and conversation. But the real mafia never worked that way. Behind Tony Soprano stood a real man, Vincent Palermo, a New Jersey crime boss whose power came not from charisma, but from absence. No therapy, no speeches, no self-doubt. Palermo did not humanize himself to control others. He erased people until control was automatic. This story is not about whether Tony Soprano feels real. It's about why the real version had to be stripped of humanity to survive. Because the most dangerous mafia boss isn't the one you understand. It's the one you never hear from until someone vanishes and no one asks why. That is the difference between Tony Soprano, the character, and Vincent Palermo, the reality. What made The Sopranos revolutionary was not its violence, but its intimacy. For the first time, a mafia boss wasn't framed as a distant threat or a faceless villain. He was framed as a protagonist. Tony Soprano is introduced not through his crimes, but through his panic attacks, his family conflicts, and his quiet fear of losing control. Before the audience ever sees the full scale of his brutality, they are invited inside his head. This narrative choice changes everything. Tony Soprano on screen is violent, but he is also self-aware. He reflects, he doubts, he justifies. Therapy becomes the show's most powerful device. Not because it redeems him, but because it explains him. Each session reframes murder, extortion, and betrayal as symptoms of stress, legacy, and emotional damage. Crime becomes psychology, brutality becomes background. Television thrives on continuity, and Tony's humanity is the glue. Viewers follow him not because he is good, but because he is knowable. His anger has triggers, his cruelty has logic, his decisions feel reactive rather than predatory. This creates a dangerous alignment. The audience begins to experience the mafia world from inside Tony's perspective, where violence is normalized as management and fear is reframed as leadership. The show also surrounds Tony with contrast. He is more thoughtful than his subordinates, more strategic than his rivals, more conflicted than the stereotypes that came before him. This positioning quietly elevates him. When others are impulsive or cruel, Tony appears measured by comparison, even when ordering executions. Context becomes camouflage. Humor plays a critical role. Tony jokes, he complains, he mocks himself. Laughter disarms judgment. Scenes that would be horrifying in isolation become tolerable because they are embedded in domestic chaos and dark comedy. The viewer isn't asked to approve of Tony's actions, only to stay with him long enough to understand why he takes them. This is how the humanized monster is built, not by denying violence, but by embedding it inside relatability. The show does not argue that Tony Soprano is innocent. It argues that he is complicated, and complexity is the fastest path to forgiveness. But this framing carries a cost. By turning a mafia boss into a psychological case study, the show shifts attention away from consequences and toward motivation. Victims become peripheral. Communities disappear. What remains is a man struggling with power, not the damage power inflicts. Tony Soprano works because television needs a soul to follow. Real mafia bosses do not survive by having one on display. And that is where the screen version ends. And the real story of Vincent Palermo begins. Outside television, there was no therapist's couch, no confessional monologue, and no audience invited to empathize. The real man behind the myth was Vincent Palermo, a New Jersey crime boss known not for charisma, but for absence. While Tony Soprano dominates scenes through personality, Palermo dominated reality through silence, distance, and results. He did not explain power, he enforced it. Palermo's authority did not come from being liked or understood. It came from predictability in violence and unpredictability in presence. He rarely appeared. He rarely spoke publicly. And he never needed to perform leadership. In real organized crime, visibility is risk. Palermo minimized that risk by removing himself from narratives altogether. No interviews, no quotable lines, no humanizing moments. What people knew about him came indirectly through disappearances, orders carried out, and spaces suddenly left empty. This is the fundamental difference fiction cannot comfortably portray. Real mob power is not theatrical, it is administrative. Decisions are made quietly, consequences arrive without warning. Palermo did not build loyalty through bonding or emotional manipulation. He maintained order by making outcomes automatic. Cross a line, and something irreversible happened. No debate, no reflection, no second act. Unlike Tony Soprano, Palermo did not need to manage his image. He managed risk, he avoided unnecessary conflict, delegated violence efficiently, and kept his personal life sealed off. There were no public struggles, no visible doubts, not because he lacked them, but because showing them would have been dangerous. In the real mafia, introspection is not depth, it is exposure. Law enforcement understood this distinction well. Palermo was harder to prosecute, not because he was more sophisticated, but because he was less visible. He did not narrate his own life. He did not place himself at the center of every event. He existed at a remove, allowing others to absorb attention and liability. This made him harder to map, harder to predict, and harder to humanize. And that is precisely why he mattered. Where Tony Soprano creates drama, Palermo created voids. Where Tony negotiates through conversation, Palermo resolved issues through finality. The show teaches us to see a boss as a man wrestling with his conscience. Reality shows us something colder. A boss as a function, a node that processes conflict into outcomes. Television needs faces. Real power prefers none. Vincent Palermo didn't need an audience to rule. He needed people to stop asking questions. And when they did, the system worked exactly as intended. The most unrealistic element of The Sopranos isn't the violence, it's the talking. Tony Soprano survives episode after episode because he externalizes his inner life. He explains fear. He names guilt. He dissects rage. Therapy turns power into dialogue, and dialogue into control. On screen, confession is a tool. It releases pressure without consequence. In real organized crime, confession is a death wish. The real boss behind the myth, Vincent Palermo, operated in a culture where speech creates liability. Words travel. Words can be recorded. Words can be repeated by people who are scared, drunk, arrested, or bargaining for their lives. In that environment, silence isn't stoicism, it's survival. Palermo didn't manage stress by talking it out. He eliminated stress by removing variables. This is the gap fiction cannot bridge without collapsing its own premise. A TV series needs interiority. It needs motives spoken aloud. It needs scenes where a character explains himself so the audience can keep pace. Real power does the opposite. It compresses emotion, minimizes expression, and outsources action. The fewer words you speak, the fewer edges you expose. Tony Soprano's therapy sessions create empathy by design. They frame violence as response, not initiation. They convert brutality into consequence of trauma. Palermo's world had no such reframing. There were no safe rooms, no neutral listeners, no controlled disclosures. Feelings were not processed. They were hidden. Doubt was not discussed. It was dangerous. The moment a boss begins explaining himself, he signals uncertainty, and uncertainty invites challenge. There is also a structural reason silence mattered. Real bosses survive by not being the source. Orders are indirect. Messages are filtered. Decisions are distributed. Palermo didn't need to justify outcomes, because outcomes justified themselves. Someone vanished. Business continued. Questions stopped. That's not narrative, it's procedure. Television teaches us that understanding leads to power. Reality teaches the opposite. Being understood is exposure. Tony Soprano is compelling because we know him. Vincent Palermo was effective because no one did. The show invites the audience inside the boss's head. The real boss's head was the last place anyone wanted to be. This difference explains why the fictional version feels deep, while the real version feels empty. But emptiness is not absence of control, it is control perfected. When nothing is said, nothing can be used. When nothing is confessed, nothing can be leveraged. Tony Soprano survives by being heard. Vincent Palermo survived by being unreadable. And in the real Mafia, the man who never needs to explain himself is the one who lasts the longest. Real Mafia power does not announce itself. It removes obstacles and leaves silence behind. While Tony Soprano dominates his world through confrontation and personality, the real system that inspired him operated through something far colder: disappearance. In New Jersey, authority wasn't measured by how loudly a boss spoke, but by how little needed to be said before things happened. In reality, violence was not emotional or impulsive. It was administrative. Decisions were made quietly, passed down indirectly, and executed without ceremony. People didn't argue with power, they adjusted to it. A familiar face stopped showing up. A phone stopped ringing. A business changed hands overnight. The absence itself became the message. No threats were required when outcomes were already understood. This is where fiction fundamentally misleads. Television needs scenes. Reality relies on gaps. When someone vanished, there was no explanation because explanation creates exposure. The goal wasn't to inspire fear in the moment. It was to create predictable compliance over time. Once enough examples existed, enforcement became automatic. No one needed to ask what would happen next. The contrast with Tony Soprano is stark. Tony's authority is constantly tested. He negotiates, persuades, reassures, intimidates. His power is visible because it must be maintained in front of others and in front of the audience. Real power worked differently. It reduced the need for maintenance by eliminating friction. Fewer conversations, fewer conflicts, fewer witnesses. Blood, in the real world, was not spectacle. It was finality. There were no moral debates, no psychological breakdowns, no second chances staged for drama. Once a line was crossed, the response was decisive and impersonal. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was risk management. Uncertainty creates instability. Instability attracts attention. Attention destroys organizations. That is why real bosses avoided theatrics. The louder the personality, the larger the target. Charisma invites curiosity. Curiosity invites scrutiny. Silence does the opposite. It collapses narratives before they form. It leaves nothing for outsiders to latch onto. And in organized crime, what cannot be named is far harder to prosecute. Tony Soprano's world is compelling because it's expressive. The real world was effective because it was empty. Power didn't live in speeches or therapy sessions. It lived in the shared understanding that some outcomes were irreversible. And once that understanding settled in, violence became less frequent not because power weakened, but because it no longer needed to prove itself. That is the difference between drama and dominance. What The Sopranos ultimately accomplished was not realism, it was translation. It took a world built on fear, silence, and irreversible outcomes, and converted it into something watchable, relatable, and even comforting. Violence remained, but it was contextualized. Brutality persisted, but it was explained. The Mafia, once defined by what could not be said, was transformed into a space where everything was discussed. Television did this by domesticating power. Tony Soprano isn't introduced as an executioner. He's introduced as a father. His crimes exist, but they are framed as consequences of stress, legacy, and emotional imbalance. By anchoring the story in family dinners, therapy sessions, and personal frustration, the show relocates danger from the streets into the psyche. Crime becomes character development. Control becomes self-management. This reframing has a powerful effect. When viewers understand a character's inner life, they begin to separate motive from outcome. Tony's decisions feel reactive, not predatory. His violence feels circumstantial, not structural. The audience doesn't excuse his actions, but they contextualize them. And context is the first step toward tolerance. The show also replaces finality with process. In reality, power operates by ending problems decisively. On television, power is something that must be constantly negotiated, discussed, and revisited. Conflicts recur, relationships reset, consequences are delayed. This keeps the narrative alive. But it also softens the truth. Real mafia power works precisely because it does not allow second acts. By humanizing the boss, television unintentionally protects the system. Viewers focus on Tony's emotions instead of the machinery beneath him. The victims fade into the background. Communities disappear entirely. What remains is a charismatic center of gravity that absorbs attention while deflecting accountability. The mob becomes a setting for existential drama rather than an engine of damage. This doesn't mean The Sopranos is dishonest. It means it is selective by necessity. Television needs continuity, empathy, and conversation. Real organized crime needs none of those things. When the two collide, the medium wins, and reality is reshaped to fit the frame. The result is a cultural inversion. The most dangerous criminal organization in American history becomes safe to analyze, safe to discuss, and eventually, safe to enjoy. The audience leaves feeling informed, even enlightened, without ever confronting how incompatible that comfort is with how power actually functioned. Television didn't glorify the mafia by exaggerating it. It did something more effective. It made it understandable. And once something becomes understandable, it stops feeling truly dangerous even when it still is. In the end, the difference between Tony Soprano and Vincent Palermo is not style, it is function. One exists to be watched, analyzed, and endlessly discussed. The other existed to end discussions before they started. Television gave us a mafia boss who talks, reflects, jokes, and doubts. Reality produced a boss who did not need to explain anything for power to work. Tony Soprano survives as a cultural icon because he invites understanding. His violence is framed through emotion, his cruelty through psychology, his authority through conversation. We are allowed inside his world, and that access creates comfort even when the actions themselves remain brutal. Understanding becomes a substitute for accountability. Vincent Palermo left no such opening. His power did not depend on empathy or narrative. It depended on absence, finality, and the shared knowledge that some outcomes could not be reversed. He didn't humanize himself to maintain control. He removed people until control became automatic. No therapy, no confessions, no audience participation. This is the illusion at the heart of modern crime storytelling. When power is made relatable, it becomes tolerable. When violence is explained, it feels less threatening. And when criminal systems are filtered through personal struggle, their true mechanics fade from view. What remains is drama, not dominance. The real Sopranos boss was never meant to be loved, debated, or understood. He was meant to be unseen, unrecorded and unquestioned. That is why he mattered, and that is why his story resists adaptation. Hollywood gave us a mob boss to analyze. Reality gave us one to avoid. And between those two versions lies the uncomfortable truth. The most effective power is the kind that never asks for your attention.